Hello, fellow Rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Wanted to go over a story from CNBC that kind of dovetails on our last video. This story involves India doing a trade deal or an arrangement with Russia to trade their goods and services back and forth cross-border and settle in rupees and rubles. And this is getting around the sanctions, I'm guessing, in which they would have potentially settled in dollars. And this is just one step closer to the world kind of de-dollarizing. I'm not here to say that the dollar is going to lose reserve status tomorrow or in 3 years, 5 years. But these are the signposts, as Luke Groman was saying, that the process is gradually starting to happen. Let's get into this article from CNBC Asia Pacific News. Title: India's Rupee Ruble trade arrangement with Russia may be ready in a week, says export body chief. So key talking points. India's finance ministry and the Reserve Bank of India have not commented so far on the mechanism which would let Indian exporters continue their business with Russia even after Western sanctions restricted international payment mechanism. Okay. Yeah, that's just a misunderstanding of the banking system. Again, this is not a big deal. They don't necessarily need SWIFT. They don't need the infrastructure. They just need to have banks that are willing to do business with each other, and they can pretty much do business. I guess if they want to settle on the balance sheet of the central banks themselves, they would need a way to do that, or the central banks would have to be in agreement. But I don't think that's really a big deal, and or not as big of a deal as maybe they're making it out to be. I think they could sort that out in an afternoon. There have been consolations between the central bank governor, the finance minister, banks, and said A. Saktival, president of the Federation of Indian Export Organizations. However, continued trade with Russia risks angering Western nations. We'll get into that in just a moment, including the U.S., which have imposed sanctions on Moscow for its attack on Ukraine. Oh, this guy's in Dubai. I didn't notice that. That's a whole nother video right there. That's really interesting. I did not notice that before. So India is expected to announce a payment arrangement, like we said, that would allow the trade with Russia to continue. Again, I don't think that's really a complex thing that they need to sort out. This so-called rupee-ruble trade mechanism would come as early as next week. And so, let's assume that majority of these transactions, they are settling in dollars or maybe even euros, and they start to figure out a way around that where they're just settling in rupees or dollars. Let's just say that the war with Ukraine ends sooner than later, which hopefully we're all praying for, obviously. Well, what would be the incentive for Russia and India to go back to the system they were using if they figure out this new way to do it, in which the West and the United States has far less leverage? Or said another way, where these two countries are more in control of their own financial destiny, let's say, that doesn't give the United States the ability to use this as a weapon against them if they don't like what they're doing or maybe even who they're supporting. Obviously, I think there'd be a huge incentive for the countries involved, i.e. Russia, India, to say, you know what, we're just going to stick with this system. It's working well. So Saktival was the Indian gentleman that's, I think, ahead of their this export organization. Added the international sanctions on Russia provide Indian exporters with an opportunity to expand into the Russian market. Great point. I mean, and this is something that's kind of a knock-on effect that we're not considering. If all of these virtue signaling corporations, if all the McDonald's and the Starbucks, as an example, pull out of Russia, if I'm an Indian exporter or an Indian company, I'm going to see that as an opportunity. Let's go in there and take market share, and or to export to Russia. I'm going back to the article here, and it looks like they export to Russia is not much, only agriculture, pharmaceutical products. Now that the whole of the West is banning Russia, there will be more opportunity for Indian firms to enter Russia, again, grow their market share. So they say that the other side of the coin here is that this might provoke the West. So we'll continue reading. However, continuing trade with Russia risks angering Western nations, including the United States, which have imposed sanctions on Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. is India's biggest export market. According to India's official data, Indian-U.S. trade in calendar year 2021 was $112 billion, consisting of $71 billion in exports and $41 billion in imports. And they go on to say how the numbers for Russia far lower. So a lot of people would push back on, or would say, well, there you go, George. See, the United States has all the leverage because India is not going to lose one of its best customers just to try to take, roll the dice on growing market share in Russia. But I would push back on that. I'd say, well, who's got the leverage here? Because if you are, let's say you are let's say you're the average American, but you have no ability, none, to buy your own food. The only way that you can get food is by going to a restaurant. And now that might not be a problem because you make a lot of money and you can afford eating out for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But let's say that there's a restaurant that pisses you off. You don't like what they're doing. Well, you can say, fine, I'm not going to go to that restaurant anymore. But at a certain point, you are held hostage by those restaurants. Meaning, if all the restaurants said, you know what? We're not going to serve you. Well, what would that person do? What would that American do? Then they're in a position where they have to beg for those restaurants to serve them, or else they're not going to get any food. See, where if this example individual we're referring to, if they had the ability to buy and prepare their own food, then they wouldn't really be held hostage by the restaurants. You see, China, India, all these other countries, they're the restaurants. The United States is the person that cannot buy their own food, that cannot prepare their own food. So although when they start saying, okay, I'm not going to give my money to that restaurant. Yes, the customer does have leverage. But at a certain point, they can't ban or they can't say that they're not going to give their business to any restaurants because then they wouldn't have any food. So you see what I'm saying? It's this relationship where at the beginning it seems like the customer has all the leverage. But at the end, you realize that the customer doesn't have much leverage at all, especially if the restaurants start cooperating with one another. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. So, provoking the West, I don't know how much or how mad the West can allow themselves to be, right? When they don't prepare their own food. And obviously what I'm referring to is goods, right? We don't make any of our own stuff. So we can, sure, you can kind of puff up your chest and say that we're not going to accept any stuff from India. You're bad boy, India, bad. But we can only do that to so many people before we don't have any stuff and our economy collapses because we are dependent on those other countries. So going back to the article here, guys, when asked about the prospect of U.S. repercussions for trading with China, Sakthival was sanguine as India had taken a neutral stand on the war in Ukraine. The government will take into account all factors, The government is playing it very carefully, he said. Sounds like someone who's actually thinking and not feeling, right? I mean, I don't know why countries, i.e. the United States, wouldn't take such an approach where, you know what, this doesn't involve us. We're taking a neutral stand. Or at least take a position where, you know what, we're going to condemn Russia. We might implement sanctions, but we want to be very, very clear that we are playing this situation. We understand that there's a lot of factors at play. We're taking everything into account, and we are playing it very carefully. I think that's a prudent approach from any government, but that's obviously not what we're seeing from our government. To this, and a great example I'd use is how this complete idiot, I think it was Lindsey Graham, came out on Twitter the other day saying how that someone needs to assassinate Putin. Okay, that's an example of not playing it very carefully. That's an example of not thinking. That's an example of using pure emotion and feeling. And again, that is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to take the approach of the Indian government here, and even if we're not taking their approach completely from the standpoint of not implementing sanctions, we should at least take their approach of just being calm and rational about the situation and humble. And admitting that this is very delicate, it's very complicated, and we need to take this situation seriously and very carefully. Even if you or the government wants to implement these sanctions to kind of push back. I think you guys get what I'm saying there. But this is just another example. And one thing I was going to go over with you guys as well is this article from, we went over this earlier, just in case you didn't see the last video that I was referencing. This is just, I'll go over the headline here. Putin wants unfriendly countries to pay for Russian gas in rubles. So this is further transition away from the dollar. This thing with the rupee and the rubles with India, further transition away from the dollar. And if you guys were watching the news last week, Saudi Arabia considers accepting yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales. Again, moving away from the dollars. And look at the kind of the subheading here. Talks between, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Riyadh, hopefully that's right, and Beijing have accelerated as the Saudi unhappiness grows with Washington. So, again, what the United States is doing, you can say that they're justified. That's fine. But we have to realize that there are unintended consequences. There are knock-on effects. And that even if we do take a tough stance with Russia, we need, or we should be doing it in a way that is calm, collected, and rational. But instead, what we're doing is the bull in a china shop approach. All right, guys, that's more news on how the global economy is gradually transitioning away from the dollar. And our approach to Russia, Ukraine is exacerbating it, making that transition even faster. But again, I want to be clear, this does not mean that the dollar is going to lose reserve status tomorrow or in 3 years. Still, in my opinion, 10, 15 years away. But this makes the timeline, this consolidates the timeline, I guess, or accelerates the timeline. Maybe that's the best way to say it. All right, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, guys. And always remember to stand up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and we'll see you on the next video.